So about a month ago, I finished up a series of shorts that many of you guys have seen or at least heard about. They were the Socrates Philosophy Bedwars shorts, and they've done better than any other video on my channel, ever. The problem with the shorts is that they are all broken up into over 30 parts. That makes the argument a little bit difficult to follow. Today, I'm going to provide the complete argument for all of you guys who care enough to watch it. It's actually pretty interesting, you should definitely watch it. Also, everyone like the video real quick or else you won't understand what Socrates is saying. So there's a Greek philosopher that many of you have probably heard of. His name is Plato, and he lived around 400 BC. He was the student of Socrates and eventually the teacher of Aristotle, who are two more famous philosophers that you've probably heard of. He wrote a book called The Republic, which is actually centered around Socrates. Socrates is probably one of the smartest men you'll ever hear of, and his arguments in the book are very strange. But before we get into the book, Plato's Republic, we need to know how Socrates argues. Basically, he doesn't claim to know anything. He utilizes the Socratic question, which is based around the premise that he doesn't know anything. He picks apart his opponent's argument bit by bit, and he does this by asking logical questions. Now, he's a genius. These questions aren't random. They go down a specific path to get to the conclusion that he wants. Plato's Republic starts out with Socrates talking with a wise old family friend, Cephalus, asking him about the definition of justice and wanting to learn from his old age. More likely, he just wants to start a debate and a logical argument with his friends in the room. Cephalus says that justice is telling the truth and giving back to one what is owed. Now, Socrates then points out the flaw in this definition. You might borrow an axe from a friend, but when he demands it back, he's drunk. It wouldn't be just to give it back to him then, would it? Cephalus agrees, and Socrates points out that they must discard that definition of justice. His friend Polemarchus interjects and says that they must not throw out the definition, pointing out that a famous teacher or sophist of the time named Simonides uses just that definition for justice. He gives an argument to Socrates defending it. Polemarchus says that justice is giving back to someone what you owe them. Socrates says that this can't possibly be true because if he borrowed an axe from a friend and he asked for it back when he was drunk, it wouldn't be just for him to give it back to him. Polemarchus agrees and specifies that you give what is good to friends and what is bad to enemies. Socrates asks then if what Simonides meant is to give what is appropriate to each person, and Polemarchus says yes. Socrates then asks whether the expertise of medicine gives what is appropriate and owed to others, such as medicines, antibodies, and vaccines. Now, when Socrates talks about the expertise of something, he means like a career, like somebody who's a doctor has the expertise of medicine. And so, therefore, giving what is appropriate and owed to others, such as medicines, antibodies, and vaccines, are good for that expertise. Polemarchus agrees. He then asks what the expertise of justice would give, which is owed and appropriate to others. Polemarchus says that would give benefit to friends and harm to enemies, like usual. Socrates asks how a just person is able to benefit friends and harm enemies. Polemarchus says in respect to war and peace, which makes sense considering they're friends and enemies. Socrates asks then if the expertise of justice is of no use during peacetime. Polemarchus says that that doesn't sound right, it should be. Socrates asks then, what is justice used for in peacetime? And Polemarchus says it's used for business associations and agreements. Socrates then asks how an expert in justice is better than like a bricklayer at business associations. Polemarchus says relating to money. Socrates then asked, wouldn't a horse groomer know how to make better purchases with money relating to a horse than a person with a justice expertise? Polemarchus agrees and says that justice must be most useful when the money is sitting idle and unused then. Socrates follows up by asking if justice would also be useful when a knife or a lyre is unused. Polemarchus says yeah, it would be. Socrates then sums up Polemarchus' point, which is that justice is useful only when something is not being used. Socrates follows the logic and asks Polemarchus if justice is useful in keeping things safe when they're unused. Polemarchus says yes, that's exactly what. Socrates says okay, and then he takes an unexpected turn with his logic. He asks if a doctor, someone who specializes in keeping the human body healthy, would also be the one most able to get it sick and get away with it. Polemarchus says yes, because he has the most knowledge about how to do so. Socrates asks if a person is good at keeping the army safe from the enemy. Would he be good at stealing a march on the enemy too? Polemarchus replies with a resounding yes. Socrates asks then if the general rule is that if someone is good at keeping something safe, they're also good at stealing it. Polemarchus says, yeah, that seems right. Socrates points out then that if someone is good at keeping money safe, they would also be good at stealing it then. Polemarchus tentatively agrees to this. Socrates says, okay, so justice is an expertise in which you steal to benefit your friends and harm your enemies? Polemarchus says that doesn't sound right, and he doesn't really know what he had in mind now. Socrates follows up with another question. He asks how someone qualifies a friend. Polemarchus says that friends are people who someone thinks are good. Socrates asks if humans can have error and make mistakes in judgment. Polemarchus says yes, they definitely can. Socrates says that someone can have bad men as friends and good men as enemies then. Polemarchus agrees with this. Socrates points out then that if a just person is enemies with a good person, he will be harming the good person instead of the bad. Polemarchus reacts to this and says that his argument's wrong. He revises his statement and says that justice harms the unjust and helps the just, instead of harming enemies and helping friends. Socrates says then that in this case it would be just for people to harm their unjust friends and help their just enemies, and this is exactly the opposite of Simonides' argument, which they started with. Polemarchus agrees that yes, it's the opposite, but he thinks that if they change their definition of a friend, that it'll fix the argument. Socrates says, okay, what do you propose? Polemarchus proposes that friends are not only those who seem good, but are actually good, and enemies are those who not only seem bad, but are actually bad. Socrates says, okay, so then justice is responsible for helping friends who are actually good and harming those enemies who are actually bad. Polemarchus says, yes, that's a wonderful way of quantifying it. Socrates then takes the argument in another unexpected direction. He asks Polemarchus if it's the business of the just person to harm any other person whatsoever. Polemarchus says yes, those who are enemies and bad should be harmed. Socrates asks if harming a horse makes it better or worse according to equine goodness. Polemarchus says worse. Socrates then asks if harming a dog makes it better or worse according to canine goodness. Polemarchus again says worse. Socrates asks, can we say the same things about humans? Do they worsen according to human goodness when harmed? Polemarchus says, yes, that sounds about right. Socrates says, isn't human goodness justice though? Polemarchus says, absolutely. Socrates says then that a person with justice expertise harming an unjust person would make him even more unjust. Polemarchus says, yeah, that sounds right. Socrates then steers the conversation in another seemingly random direction, but it's really not. Don't be fooled. He asks if a musician can use their expertise to make people musically ignorant. Polemarchus says no, that's impossible. Socrates then asks if a horse expert could use his expertise to make someone into a non-horse expert. Polemarchus again says no, absolutely not. Socrates immediately follows this up and asks if someone with a justice expertise can use it to make someone else bad. Polemarchus says no, not at all. Socrates says, in that case, it's not a function of the just person to do harm, whether to an enemy or a friend, because he'll making the unjust person more unjust. Polemarchus agrees with Socrates. The just person can't do harm as part of their justice expertise. Socrates points out that this disproves the original claim that Simonides made, that justice is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. Polemarchus agrees heartily and says that he's ready to argue with anyone else now who would hold that position. Now, during this whole entire argument, one of their friends, Thrasymachus, had been trying to jump into the argument, and now he got his chance. He starts a new argument, arguing that justice is what's in the interest of the stronger. He claimed that rulers are the stronger. Justice is what's in the interest of them. Socrates asks his first question to Thrasymachus. He asks if those in power make laws in their own interest. Thrasymachus says yes to this, they do. Socrates then asks if those in power slip up sometimes and make mistakes. Thrasymachus agrees to this. Socrates says, okay, then the rulers sometimes make laws which go against the interests of themselves. And since the weak need to obey all laws, it's just to do what's in the interest of the stronger, as well as what is against the interest of the stronger, since they're following all of the laws, even the ones that were a mistake. Thrasymachus says Socrates is mistaking his meaning of the stronger. By stronger, he means someone who is perfectly strong and never makes mistakes, like making a law which isn't in his own interests. Socrates says, okay, we can go with that definition. He asks what the expertise of doctoring provides benefit to. Thrasymachus says, the body. Okay, Socrates says, what does the expertise of steersmanship provide benefit to? Thrasymachus says, the sailors on the ship. Socrates then asks a very weird question. He asks if the expertise of being a doctor provides any benefit to its own expertise, which is the expertise of being a doctor. Thrasymachus says no. If an expertise is perfect and complete, it doesn't need anything to provide benefit to it, especially not its own expertise. Socrates says, okay, the expertise of horses doesn't look out for its own interests, but the interests of the horses? Thrasymachus says, yes. And surely, Thrasymachus, Socrates says, different expertises have power over that which they provide benefit to. Thrasymachus very reluctantly agrees to this. Socrates finesses his previous argument by capitalizing and pointing out that someone with an expertise doesn't look out for the interests of themselves, but the interests of their subject, or those who are under their expertise. Now, Thrasymachus doesn't really agree to this. Instead, he points out that shepherds fatten up their sheep in order to eat them later, so they're actually doing what's in the interest of themselves, even though it might seem that they aren't. Thrasymachus is basically starting a new argument here, and not acknowledging that his previous one was absolutely destroyed. Thrasymachus finishes up his new argument by saying that it's actually much better and more profitable to be unjust rather than just, because the unjust person can better manipulate situations for personal gain. Socrates starts off by finishing his previous argument that Thrasymachus tried to ignore. He asks Thrasymachus if rulers even want to rule. Thrasymachus says, yes, of course. Socrates says, has it ever occurred to you that they don't want to? Like, for example, if we look at all the other expertises, they all expect to be paid in their course of work, because they don't actually get any benefit from their expertise, but only their quote-unquote subjects do. Socrates follows up this point by asking Thrasymachus if expertises differ by the different capacity that they have, meaning the different types of benefits that they provide. Thrasymachus says yes, that's how they differ. And would they each provide particular benefits, not just general ones, but particular ones? Socrates follows up. Yes, indeed they would, Thrasymachus answers. Socrates then says, the benefit of fees would be gained from the expertise of fee earning. Thrasymachus reluctantly agrees that the benefit of fees comes from the expertise of fee earning, and not just from general. Thrasymachus reluctantly agrees to this. Okay, says Socrates. The expertise itself does not provide any benefit to itself then. Only the expertise of fee earning, which provides fees or penalties. What do you mean penalties? Asked Thrasymachus. When someone is being ruled, it's a penalty for him to be ruled by someone that he might consider as not as smart as him. This is why rulers generally rule. Not because they want to, but because they don't want the penalty of being ruled by someone inferior. Thrasymachus says, okay, I'll concede to that argument, but you still haven't answered my argument about how being unjust is actually more profitable than being just. Socrates asks Thrasymachus if he's claiming that perfect injustice is more profitable than perfect justice. Thrasymachus says, of course, I've already told you the reasons why I say that. Do you also think that justice is a form of badness and injustice a form of goodness then? Asks Socrates. Thrasymachus replies, not exactly. Justice is more a form of simple-mindedness and badness, and injustice a form of goodness and wisdom. Socrates brings out one of his weird and unexpected questions by asking if a just person would try to outdo another just person. Thrasymachus says no, especially not because he's the simple-minded person that we are making him out to be. Okay, says Socrates, Would an unjust person try to outdo an unjust person? Thrasymachus says, of course. They're each trying to get on top. Socrates sums up. So the unjust person tries to outdo both his like and unlike, whereas the just person only tries to outdo his unlike. Precisely, Thrasymachus answered. And does the unjust person not only have characteristics of, but also resemble goodness and intelligence, and the just person vice versa? Socrates asks. Thrasymachus says, of course. How could they not resemble what they actually are? Socrates then asks another one of his unexpected but genius questions here. He asks, if one person is a musical expert and the other is not, which would you call intelligent? The musical expert obviously is intelligent and the non-expert unintelligent, responds Thrasymachus. Would you call the respects in which he is intelligent good, and the ways in which the other is unintelligent bad? Follows up Socrates. Thrasymachus responds, yes, I would. That's just taking the basic definitions. Now, picture that they were each tuning a guitar, Thrasymachus. Would the musical expert try to outdo the non-expert in tuning the guitar? Of course the expert would try to outdo the non-expert, replies Thrasymachus. He would have to, or else he wouldn't be an expert. But would a musical expert try to outdo another musical expert in tuning the guitar? Socrates follows up. Thrasymachus says, of course not, there's no reason to, since they're both experts. Now, would a non-expert try to outdo both the expert and the other non-experts? Socrates asks. Yes, the non-expert would try to outdo both the expert and the non-expert, Thrasymachus says. And would you call the expert wise? Asks Socrates. Yes, says Thrasymachus. And would you call the wise person good? Socrates continues his arguing. Of course, replies Thrasymachus. In that case, Thrasymachus, says Socrates, the wise and good person will want to outdo only the person unlike himself, and the ignorant and bad person will want to outdo both the person unlike himself and the person like himself. Socrates asks, didn't we say that the unjust person wants to outdo both the just person as well as the unjust, and the just person only wants to outdo the unjust? Thrasymachus very reluctantly agrees to this. Then the unjust person is both bad and ignorant, while the just person is wise and good, Socrates responds. Thrasymachus has no response to this. His argument about unjust being wise and good was completely disproven. I still have to answer your argument about injustice being stronger, says Socrates. Do you, Thrasymachus, think that a city, pirates, or an army could achieve anything if they treated each other unjustly? Socrates asks. Of course not, Thrasymachus replies. Socrates then asks, and would they probably achieve more as a unit if they treated one another justly? Thrasymachus replies, that logically follows, yes. So in general, Socrates continues, injustice breeds factions, hatred, and fighting among yourselves, whereas justice brings about like-mindedness and friendship. Yes, that makes sense, Thrasymachus responds. Socrates asks, if injustice occurs between only two people, and not just a large group, will it still cause strife and hatred? Certainly, Thrasymachus replies. And are the gods just? Asks Socrates. Of course they are, responds Thrasymachus. Socrates follows up. Then a human being, perfectly unjust, will be constantly at strife with his city, his army, his household, the gods, and every other person that he ever comes into one-on-one contact with. In addition, Thrasymachus, he continues, if someone is perfectly unjust, he will be incapable of anything because its mind will be at strife with itself. Yes, I suppose that makes sense, Thrasymachus responds. We should also find out if unjust people live happier lives, though, responds Socrates. Tell me, Thrasymachus, does each thing, for instance a knife, horse, or eye, each have a function that only it does better than any other thing? Thrasymachus says, yes, that sounds about right. Socrates asks, and does each thing perform best when it's in a good condition, such as a horse running well when it's not sick? Yes, it would, replies Thrasymachus. Socrates asks, does the soul also have a function, such as ruling, planning, and everything else that we do in life? Yes, it does, replies Thrasymachus. And if the soul is in a bad condition, will it function badly? Continues Socrates. Thrasymachus responds, yes, it will. Socrates follows up, and didn't we agree that injustice is the soul being in a bad state? Yes, we did, sighs Thrasymachus. Then Thrasymachus finishes up Socrates. A man will never be stronger, happier, more wise, or better with being perfectly unjust. Only justice can provide these capabilities. That just about sums up the first book of Plato's Republic. If you've made it to the end, you're either really dedicated to this channel, or you're just a philosophy nerd, like myself. Either way, you should definitely subscribe. Oh, and you should also go watch this playlist of Socrates shorts. Just do it.